Number 14, squeegees. First of all, the squeegee should be 2 inches longer than the width of your image. So if you have an 8-inch image, you need at least 10 inches of squeegee. And the squeegee should have bolts within a 1/2 inch of the end of the squeegee. You'll see companies selling squeegees and there's no support of the blade in the corner, which means the corner of the blade is going to deflect more than the rest of the blade, and that puts down a different amount of ink because the squeegee angle is different. So you definitely want to have bolts within a 1/2 inch of the end. Most squeegees are not sold that way. Of course, you can add bolts to your own, but you want the blade supported. Now, some blades are glued in, which means they have support right to the edge. That's the good news. The bad news is that you cannot remove the blade and flip it over and use the other side when the blade gets, nicked or worn or whatever. So, in any event, the squeegee should be 2 inches longer than the width. Well, what happens if I'm doing a smaller print, like a chest print, for example? Maybe it's 4 inches. Then I would use, say, a 6-inch squeegee. And that gives me the 2 inches. And when I print, I always print with my fingers spread so it's even pressure across the blade. On a 6-inch, I always use aluminum handle, not wood, because I have found from practice that with wood, the pressure's not right. So if I'm going to print with a small squeegee, or if I'm printing white on black, I go with aluminum handle. And the difference between these two is that the bolts go through the handle right here and they're not touching the blade. And so the compression is consistent all the way along the blade. That means I have as much support on the corner as I do in the center. Also, when I print like white ink on black, I use a triple durometer blade. This happens to be a 75-95. It's kind of stiff. It's got that 95 core, which is stiff, as opposed to the wood. I would typically use 70. In fact, most of our printing we use 70. So, but in either case, the edges are sharp, not rounded, not beveled, none of that. Because what we're doing is, it's like skiving, or if you have a block of cheese and you got this tool and you're pulling off a little thin slice of the cheese to put on a cracker. That's really what you're doing here. It's all about the construction of the image. And the image is being constructed in dimension, 2 dimensions, by the stencil, or the hole in the stencil, which is your image. But the thickness depends on the thickness of the threads in your mesh and whether you're using liquid emulsion or the capillary film that's underneath. But that will control the thickness. And you want the ink cut off on the top of the screen and the fiber of the shirt on the underside of the screen, pulling that ink out. And the thickness to be determined by your stencil and your mesh, not by the squeegee bending excessively or having a rounded blade or whatever. When we print with caps, we use a 4-inch squeegee typically, because the images never exceed typically 3 inches. Sometimes they do, but a 4-inch squeegee would do the job for us, and one side of that blade is going to be up against the thin bar of the frame anyway. So those are your differences. Now, you're going to want to maintain these blades, and because they are going to get dull, you start out with a nice sharp blade, feels like a razor blade, but when you're dragging it across the screen repeatedly, that's going to wear that edge, and then the edge becomes rounded. When it's rounded, it's going to mush the ink through the screen. It's not going to cut off and give you the nice, clean dimension that the stencil calls for. It's almost like when you print, and if you have your squeegee too low and you pull the squeegee, you'll see a lot of ink left on the surface of the screen. You can see the ink still there. The ink is kind of thick, and if you get that ink to go through the screen, it will be thick on the shirt. You really want to control the thickness of the ink deposit, and for that you need a sharp edge. So make a little device here. It's homemade. It's fine sandpaper, like 300 grit. Lay it on a flat board, stand a squeegee up on the sandpaper, and then put bars on either side, which you screw into the board. Then you can pull the squeegee down that track a couple of times before each use. It's kind of like going to the barber shop, and the barber takes a leather strap and he goes up and down that strap with his razor blade when he does the sideburns. And when that customer gets out of the chair, the barber does it for the next customer. The barber does it for every customer because he's just honing that edge. He's not really taking any real material off his blade, but he's keeping that blade real sharp because it works more effectively when he's got a sharp blade. It's the same thing in the kitchen. A sharp knife works better cutting vegetables or meat or whatever than a dull knife. Sharp scissors work better than dull scissors. And you've got a critical tool in your business called a squeegee, and a sharp blade is going to work better than a dull blade. So you want to maintain your blades, and you never leave them in ink. If you store them up.